Hello, we are going to talk about energy and nutrient cycling today. This is the third lecture in our ecology unit. So let's get started. So we got to start with a little bit of elementary and middle school here and go back to the law of conservation of energy. If you remember from these, energy can't be made and it can't be destroyed. It can only cycle between different forms. It can be light and heat, it can be electrical, it can be movement energy or potential movement energy, it can be chemical. All of these different forms contain energy. This is important because all living things need energy. Remember, it's one of our characteristics of living things. The energy is needed for the life to maintain homeostasis. Keeping our body temperature the same all the time takes a lot of energy, especially if our environment is very different from our body temperature. Then we also need it to respond to stimuli. If I'm touching a hot plate and I want to move my hand away, that's going to take me energy. You want to avoid being eaten or dying, so you're going to have to move away from things. You're going to have to create shelter and things like that. You're going to need to reproduce and grow. That takes a whole lot of energy. Now, all energy on Earth originally comes from the sun. There's a special type of organism on the Earth that can capture that energy from the sun and turn it into a form that the rest of the living things on Earth can use. So let's talk about how do we get all this energy and how it moves through an ecosystem, because that's the whole point of ecology, right? How does this stuff move through the ecosystem? How does it interact? Well, the main way that it moves through the ecosystem is through food chains and food webs. So a food chain is probably what you learned in elementary school. It's a very simple model, and it shows how the energy flows in an ecosystem. It moves from the plant, like the grass, and it goes to the thing that eats the grass, then to the bird, then to the snake, then to the owl. So they all eat each other. Now, food webs are actually going to be a lot more complex. There's still a model that shows how energy flows through an ecosystem, but they're more realistic and more interconnected. It's like you're taking a bunch of food chains and putting them together. Now, food chains and food webs always begin with a plant. We call them producers or autotrophs, and I'll go over that a little bit more in a second. And then after the plant, they move on to different consumers, like your herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. The arrow only points in the direction that the energy moves. So it only goes one way. It can never go backwards. You never see the energy going from the bug to the plant. So take a minute, pause the video, and try to answer these two questions before we move on. First, give two examples of competing animals in this food web. So we learned about competition in the last lecture. Which animals might compete over the same source of food? The next thing I want you to do is write down two examples of a predator-prey relationship. Who's the predator and who's the prey? Only from this food chain or food web though, okay? When you're ready, you can press play and keep going. Now, I have an interesting question for you before we move on from this slide. Do you think plants can be in competitive relationships to each other? They can't exactly fight over food, can they? Well, they actually do all the time. Food for a plant is sunlight, and if you're a plant growing in the shade, you're not going to be getting your food. So competition occurs no matter what type of organism you are. So the way that we organize energy and the way that we talk about how it moves in an ecosystem is by assigning it a trophic level. A trophic level is just the position that the organism occupies in its food chain. So it could be the producer, it could be the herbivore, it could be the omnivore. Now, a lot of these words that we're going to be using in the next few slides have the word troph in them, and just like comes from trophic levels. Troph just means relating to food or nutrition. So every level gets energy from the level below it. It gets its food or nutrition from the level below it. So when we look at our trophic levels, there's a few key things that we need to know. The bottom level is our autotrophs. Auto means self. So an autotroph is a self-feeder. These are also called our primary producers. Then you have heterotrophs. Hetero means different, so different food or nutrition. So they're getting it from a source that's not from themselves. They're eating it from another organism. Here we have your herbivores, your carnivores, your apex predators, your omnivores, but we call them primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, and I'll get into that more later. And we also have a special level called the detritivores, or our decomposers. So autotrophs are the organisms that produce their own energy from the sun or from other chemicals that don't have carbon in them. So this is usually done through photosynthesis, and it's the foundation to all ecosystems, because without this, we wouldn't be able to capture that energy from the sun and turn it into a usable form of energy for the rest of life on Earth. It's a really fascinating dynamic here. Without these autotrophs, no life on Earth would be able to exist. So examples are things like plants, algae, phytoplankton, stuff like that. Our heterotrophs, like I said, are our consumers, the things that eat other things. So we have herbivores, which are our primary consumers. They're the first type of consumer. That's what primary means. So those are things like the cute little bunny in the picture there. They're going to be eating the plants. They get their energy directly from the plants. The plants get their energy directly from the sun. Now the next type that you know is a carnivore. These are our secondary or tertiary consumers. They will eat other animals. Either they'll eat herbivores or they'll eat other carnivores. An omnivore is one that can eat both plants and other animals. So they kind of have the widest selection of food on the earth. Often these omnivores become what we call our apex, or our top predators. Things like bears and humans, we're apex predators, and we're also omnivores. Now our last type of trophic level is a detritivore. It's just the fancy word for decomposer. Detritus just means waste or debris, and the root word vorous, it just means to eat or devour. So we're eating dead things or waste or debris. So they're very important because they'll help decompose all the dead bodies. Without that, there would just be a lot of dead material building up all over the world. But they have a very important niche. Remember, that's its role in the ecosystem. They replenish the nutrients. That's the key reason why we need detritivores. They put our nutrients back into the soil, into the air, into the water, so other organisms can use them and grow, because we need nutrients to live. So examples of detritivores are things like fungus, like mushrooms and molds. Bacteria are really big decomposers. Worms are another example. So pause the video and answer this question. What would happen if there were no detritivores? What would happen if there was no decomposers? And I don't want an answer to be, oh, well, dead stuff will pile up everywhere. Really think about this one. What would the Earth look like if we didn't have detritivores to cycle nutrients back into the ecosystem? So pause the video, and when you're done, go ahead and start it back up again and go. So the reason why you need detritivores is because of that fact that they cycle the nutrients back into the ecosystem. If there were no detritivores, eventually all of our nutrients would get stuck in dead bodies and they wouldn't get back into the ecosystem, and all life would cease to exist because there was no more nutrients available. Now, our trophic levels are often represented in what we call an energy pyramid. We always put our producers, our autotrophs, down at the bottom, and we put our consumers going higher and higher. The primary consumers are right on top of the producers because they eat the producers. Now, We can also see how we lose energy because the pyramid's getting smaller and smaller as we go up. If we had the same amount of energy as we went up, it would just be a square. But instead, we're losing energy as heat. As you move, you create heat as a byproduct of all of your chemical reactions. And that's one way that energy is cycled back into the world. But that energy then can't be used to grow and things like that. It can't be used for other animals. So let's keep going and talk about different things we can assume from this pyramid. So first thing, we have to assume that all energy is originally applied by the sun. So the way that these primary producers get their energy is by first taking it from the sun. As I said in the previous one, we lose energy as heat. That's why the pyramid gets smaller. And we have to include decomposers somehow. They're kind of on the outside of this pyramid, and they recycle the nutrients. They're not really part of energy. They get energy from all the other levels, but they don't put energy back in. They only put nutrients back in. Now, there's some numbers on this pyramid that I want to address. The 0.01%, 0.1%, 1%, all those. These are actually a myth. At one point, people thought that only 10% of the energy moves to the next level. That was just something that a guy put in at the very end of his paper. He's like, well, I think it's only 10%. And for some reason, people grabbed onto that. But it's actually not true. It can be 10%, but it can be a lot more, or it could be a lot less. It just depends on the situation. Now, what exactly is moving from one level to the other? What is the thing that the energy uses to travel from one organism to the other? It's actually in the form of chemical energy. So the way that the energy goes from the producers to the consumers is by being eaten. You store the energy in what you are, in your body. And we eat the body like the muscle or the leaf of the plant, and we break down those chemical bonds to get the energy. Just kind of interesting for you to know. All right, I already discussed how the decomposers are outside of the pyramid. They do not cycle energy back into the pyramid. They only cycle nutrients. They take energy away so they can grow, but they don't put it back in. Now let's talk about some other things that we can assume about these pyramids. The first relates to biomass. Biomass is just the total weight or mass of the organisms in a trophic level. So if you look at the one on the bottom right, the primary producers have a huge amount of biomass, and our top carnivore has very, very little. That's because we need to feed the whole world from the energy in the producers. So all of the producers have to have enough mass and energy to be able to feed all of the different consumers, the primary consumers, the secondary, and the tertiary. So as we get higher on the pyramid here, we're going to have less mass because we're losing a little bit of that energy as we go. There's also fewer top predators than there are herbivores. There's also fewer herbivores than there are producers. If there was 10 blades of grass in the world and 20 rabbits, eventually all those blades of grass would get eaten and all the rabbits would die. So you always have to have more food than you do people eating the food. There's also pyramids of numbers. So just like we said, there's more mass, there's more weight in the lower levels. That also must mean there must be more organisms in that level. So you have to have lots of producers, lots of different organisms of plants in order to feed all the different organisms of herbivores. So you always have to have more of everything on the bottom, more energy, more mass, more population, and it gets smaller as you go higher. So why must the numbers and the biomass of organisms be higher when you're lower on the pyramid? Because if it wasn't that way, we would end up using all of the energy from that level and nothing above it would be able to live. There always has to be more to feed the upper levels. Okay, I want you to answer this question in your notes. So you're going to pause it and you're going to try to figure out the answer. And we'll go over this one in class. An international food organization and a union of cattle ranchers are having a debate. The food organization says that we need to be using grains or a special kind of plant to feed people worldwide who are suffering from hunger. The cattle ranchers say that they want to be using cattle to feed people, so give people steaks. Based on what you know now about the energy, biomass, and numbers pyramid, who has the better argument? What would be better to feed the world and to stop hunger? Pause it, try to answer it, and when you're done, move on. So that's all that we have for energy, but what about the nutrients? Nutrients are substances that are essential for growth and other life processes, just like energy. We use the energy to take these nutrients and use them where we need them. Now we have to get our nutrients from the environment. We can't really make them completely on our own. We have to find the building blocks in the world around us. So that takes us back to another law in science, the law of conservation of matter. All matter, which is what makes up everything in the universe, cannot be created and it cannot be destroyed. It can only cycle into different forms, different chemical forms. It's like going from water to hydrogen and oxygen, things like that. It's just cycling into different forms. So because nutrients are a form of matter, that means they must cycle as well. That's how we get nutrients in and out of the ecosystem and the living things. So the physical bodies of the organisms and certain parts of the earth contain nutrients. So our body actually contains nutrients, but so does certain parts of the soil and the air. So we call these special cycles biogeochemical cycles. Let me tell you what that means in the next slide. So bio means life, geo means earth, and chemical relates to the elements or to chemistry. So processes from all three of these are going on in these biogeochemical cycles. We're moving between biotic and abiotic. That's how the matter moves through these cycles. So there's four main biogeochemical cycles. The first is the water cycle. The second is the carbon cycle, but oxygen is kind of tied into that a little bit. Then you have the nitrogen cycle, and finally the phosphorus cycle. We're going to go into these one by one now. So the first is the water cycle, and you've probably learned about this since you were a really little kid, so we're only going to focus on the things that may be new to you. So you know that we have gas water in the air, and it's going to precipitate in the form of snow or rain. And that's going to put water back onto the earth. That's going to run off into groundwater like aquifers, big storage areas under the ground, or into lakes and streams and rivers and into the ocean. All of that water on the surface of the earth is going to evaporate and become a gas again and condense into clouds, which then cause precipitation. Now, there's one thing that you probably didn't learn before, and that's called transpiration from plants. This is the process where plants take in water through their roots and then release that water as a vapor from their leaves. They use that water for photosynthesis, and when they're done with it, they release it back into the air. Now, 10% of all of the evaporated water comes from transpiration of plants. The other 90% comes from the oceans and the lakes and the streams. Another fascinating thing about the water cycle is that only 3% of all the water on Earth is fresh water. But fresh water is what is needed for life. Life can't use salt water. And what's even more fascinating is that of that 3% of fresh water, 70% of it is locked away in a form that we can't use. It's locked away in the ice caps or the glaciers. So only 30% is usable for life. So that's a very small amount of the water on Earth that actually can be used by life. It's kind of miraculous that we're actually all here and that this planet is just so full of life all the time. Now moving on away from the water cycle, we have the carbon and oxygen cycle. Mostly what we're talking about here is photosynthesis and what we call respiration. So we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen, and we cycle it between each other that way. All living things are made up of carbon. It's a very, very, very important element. It makes up all 4 of the main molecules in a living thing's body. It makes up proteins, it makes up carbohydrates, it makes up fats, and it makes up DNA. When you grow, you require more of this carbon, so you'll have to actually take in more from your environment. Now, oxygen is also required by living things. What the oxygen does is it unlocks as much energy from our food as possible so we can grow. Without oxygen, we'd actually be limited to only living as single cells. So these are 2 really important elements that we need. So thanks to photosynthesis and respiration, we're able to get these. But there's a little bit more to it than that, and we're going to look at just the carbon cycle in particular here. So carbon moves through the entire world, usually in the form of a living thing or in carbon dioxide. So when we talk about carbon in the air, it's in the form of carbon dioxide. And you guys are probably really familiar with this, but we're going to go into it just for a brief moment. So carbon can be put into the atmosphere, into the air, by people and animals breathing it out. It's called respiration. We can burn fossil fuels, and that will put CO2 into the air. It can evaporate from the ocean, just like water can. And when things decompose, when they die and start to decay, they give off carbon dioxide in the process. So that's how we put it into the air. Now, how do we take it out of the air? The main way is through photosynthesis. Plants take it in from the atmosphere and turn it into usable food energy and turn it into their bodies, essentially. Now, another way is just as it evaporates from the ocean can also take it back and it can be dissolved into the ocean. But carbon can also move between living things. So consumers eat carbon when they eat other plants and other animals. As I said, we're all made up of carbon, so you're going to be eating it constantly. So some organisms also use carbon to make shells, and shells can become part of mountain ranges or the bottom of the ocean. And some dead organisms and some shells get pressed down over a long period of time, and they become fossil fuels that we then burn. They can also give off carbon to detritivores, so things that break down those dead things. Our third cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is also really important for all life because it makes up proteins and DNA, and without these 2 things, life really wouldn't exist at all. So most of the nitrogen on Earth is found in the atmosphere. There's over 70% of the atmosphere is made of nitrogen, but that unfortunately is a form that life just can't use. There's really strong bonds in the nitrogen in the air, and our bodies just can't break them down, and neither can plants. So what happens is the nitrogen in the air has to be fixed before it can be used by life. That's just a special term that we use. Nitrogen fixation is the process of capturing and converting that nitrogen in the air into a form that plants can use. So the way this nitrogen fixation occurs is because there's special bacteria in the soil that can break those bonds in that nitrogen. They have the ability and the energy to break it and turn it into something else. Another way is all that energy that's built up in lightning. that lightning will break those bonds and it'll let it become part of the soil. Once the nitrogen is part of the soil, plants will actually take it up and use it to form their proteins and their DNA, and then consumers can eat it from the plants. Now, there is a really cool symbiotic relationship when it comes to the nitrogen cycle. Plants called legumes, those are like your peanuts and your peas, they have special parts of their roots that contain this special bacteria, so these plants always have nitrogen to grow. Now, some bacteria can even do something called denitrification. We're turning the nitrogen in the soil back into a gas and putting it back into the atmosphere. The final cycle is the phosphorus cycle. This one's essential for growth and development. We need it in order to grow. Now, most phosphorus on the earth is stored in the rocks, so the main way that it starts to get out of the rocks is through weathering. Weathering and precipitation will create phosphorus that can go into the water or can go into the soil, and then plants can take it up, animals eat it from the plants, and decomposers can put it back into the soil. This is not a cycle that we're going to focus on too much. I mainly want you to know that it's an important cycle and that we need it for growth and development. I'm not really going to test you on the steps or the parts of this one. So one point to ponder, you're going to pause the video and try to answer this question now. Why are biogeochemical cycles so important? Why are they important? Well, they're important because without them, we wouldn't be able to have nutrients. If they didn't cycle properly, they'd get stuck in one place, and then life wouldn't be able to access those nutrients, and it would end. There would be no life on Earth. So to summarize everything, life uses energy and nutrients for everything it does. And because of the laws of conservation of energy and matter, our energy and our nutrients can't be created or destroyed. We can only cycle them. So with energy, it cycles through different trophic levels, different types of living things through food chains and food webs. Our autotrophs will take energy from the sun, and our heterotrophs will eat that energy from the plants or from other animals. And we release that energy in the form of heat, or we give it back to the detritivores. Now, pyramids of energy, pyramids of biomass, and pyramids of numbers show how the energy moves through the ecosystem. Finally, our nutrients will move through biogeochemical cycles. These are the four main cycles: water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. I want you guys to write down any questions that you had or things that you didn't understand, and come prepared next class to ask questions. Remember, I don't lecture in class, so if you're confused, it's up to you to ask me to go over it in class. I won't do it on my own. So please, 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 if you didn't understand something, let me know, okay? I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.